The first time I laid eyes on the USS Harrisburg, I felt something I hadn't expected. Unease, quiet and cold, like the shiver before a fever takes hold. She wasn't a remarkable ship by appearance. No nuclear beast. No bristling armory of modern warfare. Just a support vessel, 40 years at sea, covered in the kind of grime that doesn't come from the ocean but from time itself. Her metal hull wore scars like a memory that refused to heal, and even before I stepped aboard, I noticed the crew didn't look back at her when they disembarked, as if leaving her behind was a privilege, not routine. I should have paid more attention to that. But I was too proud of my transfer, too thrilled with the idea of service, tradition, and finally putting my sonar training to work. Fresh out of Norfolk with polished boots and a chest full of ambition, I reported for duty at 0600 on a foggy Tuesday, carrying my sea bag and an eagerness that would burn out faster than I could ever imagine. The first thing I noticed on board was the silence. Not the efficient, focused kind of silence that good crews maintain, but something more hollow, studied, intentional. Greetings were brief, eyes darted quickly away, and conversations seemed to die the moment I walked into a room. No one was outright rude, but I couldn't shake the sense that something had been left unfinished. I chalked it up to hazing or the guarded camaraderie that sometimes formed on older ships. My bunk was in the lower quarters, port side, third rack from the floor. The metal frame groaned under me like a voice trying to speak. I laughed it off. Later that night, I wouldn't. The ship's interior was a labyrinth of mismatched compartments and retrofitted systems. Duct tape over panel seams, handwritten instructions over faded labels, and rows of old bulkheads that led to nowhere. My first briefing was brief, barely 10 minutes with Lieutenant Daniels, who handled the personnel integration with all the enthusiasm of a man cleaning his gun for the third time that day. I asked about the Z-deck, an extra sublevel I had seen marked faintly on one of the outdated blueprints in the intake file. Daniels blinked, paused, then tapped twice on the folder and said, "That's not for you." He didn't smile. He didn't blink again. He just handed me the schedule and moved on. I learned quickly that night shifts on the Harrisburg were the strangest. During the day, operations were standard, if slightly frayed around the edges. At night, however, the routine shifted. Whole areas of the ship were suddenly under maintenance, even when no work was visible. Certain doors were welded shut, and we were given alternate paths to engineering and comms. There were whispers in the mess hall, half jokes, half warnings, about things that moved around down there, or shouldn't be awake after midnight. I laughed with the others, but no one else was laughing. Just smirking thinly, watching my reaction like it meant something. The first time I asked about the ship's lower levels, the unofficial basement as it came to be called, I was met with silence so complete it became hostile. It was after a late dinner, and I'd made the mistake of trying to be friendly. A few petty officers were smoking near the aft deck, and I asked if they'd ever been below Deck C. One of them, Hayes, turned to me with a smile that didn't touch his eyes and said, "Best advice you'll ever get, rookie. Never go down to the ship's basement at midnight. You won't like what you find. And it might like you." The others chuckled, but the kind of chuckle that stank of anxiety. Nervous release. Not humor. I changed the subject, but the words stuck in my mind. I went to sleep with them echoing softly, like sonar returning from a depth it shouldn't have reached. The next morning, I received my official station, Communications Auxiliary with a secondary role in acoustic monitoring. Perfect for a sonar guy. My post was near the stern, next to an unused comms hub marked disconnected in red chalk. Strangely, the system was live when I checked it. A low hum pulsed from the receiver, and I swear for a moment it was beating in sync with my own heart. I pulled the plug. When I asked about the previous comms operator, no one seemed to know his name. Daniels just handed me a logbook with several pages missing. The roster had a line where his name should be. Black ink scribbled across it, violently, as if someone had tried to erase the man from memory, not just paper. That night, I dreamed of metal corridors, of doors creaking open into darkness that looked back, of something breathing in rhythm with the hull. I woke up drenched in sweat, the ship groaning quietly around me. I sat up, turned on the red light above my bunk, and looked around. My rack was the only one occupied in that section, yet I saw movement. Just a shadow, but real enough to make my blood run cold. Disappear behind a bulkhead 10 feet away. I didn't sleep again. I just listened. And beneath the usual creaks and groans of an aging ship, I heard something new. A thump. Then another. Rhythmic. too deliberate to be structural. By the end of the week, I had stopped asking questions, not because I had answers, but because the lack of them had started to weigh on me. The crew tolerated me, but always with that distance. They had all seen something, I was sure of it. Something they wouldn't name aloud. At night, the halls felt too long, the turns too sharp, the lights too dim, and always, that damn silence. The kind that listens back. The kind that waits. I should have asked for a transfer. I should have reported the inconsistencies, the gaps in records, the signs that something about the Harrisburg didn't add up. But I didn't. Maybe I didn't want to know. Or maybe I already did. After all, I had already opened the wrong hatch once and seen something I shouldn't have. Just a glimpse. Barely a second. But enough to know this. The basement wasn't empty. And if the rumors were true, it wasn't part of the ship either. Not really. It was something older. Deeper. And it was waiting for someone curious enough to go looking after midnight. I went back to that hatch the next day. I don't know why. Curiosity? Pride? Stupidity? I stood in front of it for a long time. I didn't open it. Not yet. But I could hear something. Faint. Wet. Like breath. Or laughter. Or both. That's when I realized it was already listening to me, too. The morning after I stood before that hatch, I reported for duty pretending I'd slept. The bags under my eyes betrayed the truth, but no one asked. No one ever asked on the Harrisburg. The ship had a way of encouraging silence, of pressing its age and pressure into your chest until words became wasteful, even dangerous. I walked the length of the auxiliary corridor leading to my station, slower than usual, lingering in each section as though my presence could dislodge some hidden truth from the rusted seams. There was a maintenance cabinet bolted to the wall between sonar storage and the decommissioned nav room, one I had never seen open. But this morning, the latch was undone, as if recently disturbed. I looked both ways, then tugged it open. Inside, beneath a fire blanket and a sealed tin of ancient emergency rations, was a tube. Metal, narrow, capped at both ends. It bore no markings, but it felt heavier than it should have, like it carried something more than weight. Something that had been waiting to be found. I opened it carefully and unfurled what was inside. It was a schematic. Old, yellowed at the edges, drawn in a hand that was precise but unmistakably human. No printer could replicate the slight inconsistencies in line thickness, the small ink blot near the stern. It was a map of the Harrisburg, clearly labeled and dated. 1983. My eyes darted across the familiar structure. Decks A through E. Command bridge, sonar, engine compartments, living quarters, mess, storage. Then I saw it. A section labeled Subdeck Z. I froze. There it was, clear as sunlight. It sat beneath the waterline, between ballast tanks and a compartment simply labeled Forward Isolation. I'd never seen that term used before, not in any briefing, not in any standard naval reference. I traced the lines with my finger. The path to reach it curved around unused mechanical shafts, passed under reinforced bulkheads, and ended at a small room at the very bottom of the ship. No hatch number. No entry marker. Just a box, shaded in gray. It had a name. Compartment 13. My skin went cold. I folded the map quickly, not wanting to be seen. That was the first time I felt like I wasn't alone in that corridor, even though I could see from one end to the other. I returned the tube to the cabinet, then hesitated. I couldn't leave it there. I couldn't trust it would still be waiting tomorrow. I took the map and walked back to my rack, each step echoing a little louder than the last. Each corner I turned coming with the faint expectation that someone, or something, might be waiting just out of sight. I reached my bunk and slipped the map under my mattress. Only then did I realize my hands were shaking. Later that day, I tried to casually ask Daniels if the ship had undergone any structural changes over the years. His eyes narrowed. Nothing that would affect operations. Why? I told him I'd noticed a gap between two panels in the stern that didn't match the schematics we'd been shown. He stared for a moment too long, then said, "Ship's age, sailor. They swell and shrink. Steel forgets." I didn't know what that meant. I don't think he did either. I stopped asking. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that room, Compartment 13, about how it wasn't listed on the modern schematics, about how the maintenance paths that supposedly led to it had been marked as sealed off years ago. I pulled out the map and studied it under my red bunk light. The more I stared at it, the more it seemed to shift. Not physically, nothing dramatic, but something about the proportions felt subtly different each time I looked away and looked back, as if the map was adjusting to match something in my mind, or worse, as if it was showing me what I expected to see. I laid it flat and compared it to the current digital deck plans I had stored on my tablet. The digital one didn't even acknowledge the compartment's existence. But on the older map, it was positioned directly beneath the auxiliary power lines. Beneath me. Right now. I dropped the tablet. I don't know why. Maybe it was the sudden weight of the idea, or the cold realization that whatever compartment 13 was, I had been sleeping directly over it. I dressed and left my bunk, careful not to wake anyone, though part of me suspected that most of them weren't asleep, only pretending, the way the whole ship pretended during daylight. I retraced the path from the schematic, using the junction numbers and auxiliary duct routes. The ship groaned softly around me, old steel flexing like joints in a dying animal. At each turn, I matched the map to reality, and it was accurate, frighteningly so. Every vent, every pipe, every access panel, it all aligned, until it didn't. I reached a wall where there should have been a junction, panel M07, according to the schematic. But instead of a maintenance hatch, I found a smooth expanse of metal, not welded, not repainted, seamless, as if it had never been built. I ran my hand along it, felt the chill of the steel, the strange vibration underneath, not from the engines, not from any pump or fan. This was something else. A steady pulse. Not quite mechanical, almost biological. I pressed my ear to it. On the other side, something was breathing. I stumbled back and nearly slipped. The map fluttered to the floor. As I bent to pick it up, I noticed something strange. The lines on the page had shifted again. Now there was an extra stairwell drawn between Deck D and Subdeck Z, one that hadn't been there before. I traced it with my finger. It led straight to the compartment labeled 13, which now had a subtitle, Containment. The word was written in smaller print, cramped, like an afterthought, or a warning. When I looked up, the wall was gone. No, not gone. Changed. A hatch now stood where the metal panel had been. It was old, rusted, marked with yellow paint barely visible beneath layers of age and grime. A symbol had been scratched into the center, a circle, with lines radiating outward like a sun, but distorted, as if melting. I didn't open it, not then. I stepped back and returned to my quarters, each step slow, each breath measured. The map burned in my hand like it was alive. I placed it under my pillow, and for the rest of the night, I lay staring at the ceiling, too afraid to blink, knowing that something had shifted in the ship, and in me. I hadn't opened the hatch, but the ship had, and it had done so for me. That much was clear now. I'd seen too much. Or maybe I had seen just enough to become part of whatever truth the Harrisburg carried in its belly. I fell asleep sometime near dawn, the sound of breathing still humming in my ears, and I dreamed of a room with no walls, only shadows moving in circles, whispering in a language I almost understood. Let me know when you're ready for Chapter 3, The Crewman Who Doesn't Exist, and I'll continue seamlessly. It began with a bottle of cheap whiskey and the kind of silence that only exists between men queasy from months at sea. We were in the supply lounge, which was little more than a cold metal room furnished with a warped table, a flickering light, and a pin-up calendar no one dared update past 2004. The engine hum was ever present, but quieter that night, as if the ship itself were holding its breath. 4 of us sat there, picking at cards and stories. No one mentioned what had happened to Connors the week before, how he'd vanished during inventory and turned up hours later in the infirmary, shaking, eyes shut tight, whispering a date none of us recognized. Instead, someone brought up the Poirot. You ever been down there? Banks asked, nodding toward me. The basement? No. Didn't know we had one. We don't, Haskins muttered, lighting a cigarette with hands that didn't seem to stop shaking. Not officially. Come on, Banks grinned, the whiskey already softening his face. Every new guy gets dared eventually. It's tradition. Midnight. You go down, take something from the storage stack in Z-Deck, come back up, and prove you're not just another desk warrior in uniform. Z-Deck? I asked. That's not on the manifest. Exactly, he said, and everyone fell quiet for a moment too long. I said yes. I don't know if it was the need to prove something or the growing weight of my own curiosity, but I agreed. Maybe part of me wanted to be the one who broke the silence everyone else lived under. Maybe I didn't believe. Not really. How could I? We were on a government vessel with redundancies for every system, cameras in every corridor, and decades of regulated routine. Ghost stories belonged in trenches, not in reinforced hulls. The dare was simple. Midnight. Go down alone. Touch the red pipe under the catwalk past Storage Sector 7. Bring something back that proves you went. Nothing valuable. A bolt, a label, a fragment. Just enough to show you were there. The red pipe was important, they all agreed. It hears you, someone said. I thought it was a joke. I should have known better. At 11:57, I left my bunk and made my way to the hatch near the aft stairwell. The ship was quieter than usual, like it had turned its head away from me. I walked past closed doors, low lights humming faintly, ventilation whispers too rhythmic to be mechanical. I reached the hatch. It wasn't locked. It never was. The Navy kept no record of Z-Deck, so there was no protocol to lock it. The metal was colder than the rest of the ship. Not just cool. Cold like it had forgotten heat. I descended carefully, one step at a time, each echo louder than the last. The air thickened with each meter. My flashlight flickered but stayed on, the beam catching flaking paint and condensation that smelled of oil and time. There were no cameras here, no signs, no comfort. The walls closed in with angles that bent slightly wrong, too narrow, too steep. Pipes ran like veins, sweating dark fluids in slow, uneven beats. Something creaked behind me. I didn't turn. I found the red pipe. It wasn't red like fresh paint. It was red like something had stained it from the inside, deep and permanent, as if it bled once and never stopped. It ran along the ceiling, then curved down into the floor, vanishing into a grate that pulsed with heat. I touched it. A low vibration hummed through my bones. Not pain exactly, but memory. Something old, wrong, familiar in the way nightmares are familiar. I crouched down and reached for a bolt loose near the pipe. As I stood up, something knocked behind me. Not a noise. A knock. 3 times. Measured. Deliberate. Like the start of a conversation. I froze. Waited. The light flickered. The knock repeated. This time farther away, behind the next corridor. I told myself it was a bulkhead shifting, metal expanding, a pipe decompressing. But the rhythm didn't match. It was too human. I turned the corner. The corridor ahead had shifted. I know this ship, even the unofficial parts I'd explored in diagrams and whispers. But this hall didn't exist. It stretched farther than the dimensions allowed. The lights above buzzed and blinked in sequence, as though guiding me forward. I walked. I don't know why. I told myself it was the dare, that I had to bring something back, that they were waiting for me. But truthfully, I walked because something behind me had begun following. Not footsteps, not breathing, just a presence. The kind you feel in your spine. Watching. Wanting. I picked up speed. The corridor narrowed, the walls pressing in, the air thicker. Ahead I saw a door. Heavy, metal, aged beyond belief. A marking, 13A. It hadn't been on the map. I reached for the latch. Before I touched it, a voice whispered behind my ear. Too soon. I turned. Nothing there. But something had spoken. Not inside my head. Not imagined. Real. Warm breath on my skin. I ran. I didn't think, didn't care about the bolt in my hand or the dare or the laughter I'd face if I returned empty-handed. I ran up the stairs, 2 at a time, ignoring the groans of the metal and the sensation that the red pipe was pulsing faster, like a heartbeat, like anticipation. When I slammed the hatch shut behind me, I locked it. Not protocol, just instinct. I stood there for a minute, listening. Nothing. Silence returned, but the silence was different now. It wasn't peace, it was waiting. I returned to the lounge. Haskins was asleep, snoring softly. Banks looked up from his cards. You didn't go, he said. I dropped the bolt on the table. They stared. No one said anything. For a long time. Then Haskins whispered, You touched it? I nodded. He stood, left without another word. The bolt sat on the table, sweating moisture that didn't come from me. That night, I didn't sleep. The air in my quarters smelled like burnt wires. And something else. Something familiar. I couldn't place it until morning. It was the smell of breath behind a locked door. I returned to the hatch 2 nights later. Not because I wanted to, but because sleep no longer came. The bolt I had brought back from the red pipe sat on the shelf near my bed, and every time I turned away from it, I heard the faintest knock in the walls. Always 3 taps. Always just after the lights dimmed. No one else heard them, or if they did, they pretended not to. And maybe I would have kept pretending too, until I opened my locker and found a piece of masking tape stuck to the inside, blank except for a number scrawled in oil. 13A. The same door. The one I almost opened. The one that whispered. This time, I went with gloves and a headlamp. No flashlight. I didn't want something that flickered, something that could betray me when I needed light most. I brought a small wrench, more for comfort than utility, and stuffed a crushed ration bar into my pocket, just in case I lost time again. I didn't tell anyone. There was no dare this time. No thrill. Just a question that now lived behind my eyes. Why did the corridor shift? I slipped through the hatch just after 23:58, moving quietly, like the walls might wake. The stairwell groaned again under my weight, but less than before, as if the ship had grown used to me. I passed the red pipe without touching it, though I swore it pulsed once as I walked by, as if in recognition. The air was thicker the deeper I went, less ventilated, but not entirely stagnant. There was a scent now I hadn't noticed before, something metallic and damp, like rust soaked in seawater and left to rot under skin. Then I reached the corridor of doors. I don't know how to describe it without sounding mad. The hallway wasn't just long, it was unreasonably long, structurally impossible. No ship, not even a carrier, had a corridor this long or this narrow. And the doors, at least 20 of them, spaced in irregular intervals. Some looked older than others, decades old, their paint faded, latches corroded. Others looked newer, but not Navy standard. Civilian doors, office doors, a sliding barn door bolted to a steel frame, a child's bedroom door with faded stickers of moons and stars. None of them made sense. None belonged. I moved slowly, trying not to step too hard, trying not to breathe too loud. Each door had something carved, etched, or burned into it. I remember the first clearly. A simple Navy bulkhead with a brass handle, above which someone had scratched, "Not your turn." The next had a warning painted in what I hoped was red ink. "Knock back and it knows." One door was sealed with chains looped through holes in the metal, padlocked 5 times, each lock wrapped in cloth. I leaned in. From inside, the faint sound of something brushing along the floor. Scraping. Circular. Like someone slowly dragging a coin across metal, again and again. One door was cold to the touch, another warm. One vibrated beneath my palm like a living thing holding its breath. I passed a door made of frosted glass and saw shadows moving behind it. Human silhouettes in impossible poses, necks bent at wrong angles, arms too long, standing still, but vibrating as if shivering in a frequency too fast for the eye to follow. I blinked. They were gone. Then I found it again. 13A. The door was older than I remembered. Or maybe I just hadn't let myself see it properly the first time. It wasn't a Navy door. It looked like something from an old hotel. Wooden, stained dark, with an antique brass knob and a peephole smeared over with something tar-like. A small plaque was nailed crookedly into the surface. "Listen first." I pressed my ear to the door, slowly. The hallway behind me felt narrower now, and the air more humid. I heard breathing. Not loud, but constant. Labored. Like someone in pain, or someone asleep and dreaming of drowning. I pulled back. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob. I didn't turn it. I just held it. The breathing stopped. I waited. The hallway waited. Then, very softly, from behind the door, my own voice said, "Come in." I dropped the wrench. I don't remember backing away, but I must have. Because the next thing I knew, I had stumbled to the other side of the corridor and fallen against one of the metal doors. The impact must have triggered something. A latch snapped. The door creaked open an inch. Inside, darkness. But I smelled something. Lemon oil, freshly polished wood, and rot. I didn't look inside. I ran. The corridor didn't want me to leave. Twice I turned corners that hadn't existed before. Once I passed the same red pipe from earlier, except this time it bled a thin line of water from a hairline crack, as though wounded. I passed a mirror bolted to the wall that showed not me, but an empty hallway behind me, even though I could feel something at my back. When I finally found the stairs again, they were steeper, older. The metal was warm and wet. I didn't look at my hands until I was back at the hatch and pulling it shut behind me. They were streaked with black, the same tar-like substance from the peephole. It smelled like copper and salt. I threw the gloves away and scrubbed my hands until the skin burned. The stain never fully left. And later, when I finally dared sleep, I woke gasping from a dream I couldn't remember. But my pillow was soaked, and my bunkmate said I'd been whispering in two voices. I didn't go back the next night. But I couldn't stop thinking about what the doors were keeping in, or keeping out. The silence that followed that night wasn't true silence. It was the kind of silence that pushes in from all sides, that amplifies every creak in the steel, every subtle tick of temperature settling in pipes, every faint intake of breath, like it was coming from 100 mouths behind the walls. After the hallway of locked doors, I stopped sleeping with my back to the wall. Not because I was afraid of something breaking in, but because I was terrified I might feel the wall breathe. The other sailors noticed I wasn't the same. I told them I was just tired, that I'd been helping down in engineering, and they believed it. Or pretended to. That was the strange thing about the USS Harrisburg. Everyone had seen something they weren't willing to explain, and we all carried it like bruises under the skin, hidden but throbbing. No one asked questions, because no one wanted the questions turned back on them. It was sometime around 03:12 when I first heard it. I'd been lying awake, staring at the ceiling of the berth, counting the bolts for the third time that night. The room was nearly dark, save for the thin emergency glow that washed everything in a sickly green hue. The sound came not from the door, but from the ventilation shaft above my locker. It wasn't the usual rush of recycled air or the mechanical hum of fans. It was soft, intermittent, deliberate, like something dragging itself across metal, not slithering, crawling, claws against aluminum. A pause. Another drag. It moved with purpose, and whatever it was heavy enough to make the metal flex ever so slightly. I felt it in my chest, like the echo of a knock that hadn't happened yet. I waited, paralyzed beneath the thin sheet, until it passed. When I finally sat up, I went to the vent and pressed my hand against it. Cold, still vibrating. A faint smell, not strong, but noticeable, like old water and iron. I told myself it was rats. I told myself maybe a raccoon had somehow gotten into the supply chain and ended up in the ductwork. I filed a maintenance report and tried to forget. But the next night, it returned. And the night after that. Each time, the path of the sound changed, looping around the berthing compartment, crawling through the overhead spaces, stopping above people's beds for just long enough to make them stir and shift in their sleep. No one mentioned it. But by the fifth night, 4 sailors had quietly requested bunks in different compartments. Only I stayed. I had to. Something about that sound. It wasn't just terrifying. It was familiar, like a rhythm I'd heard before, like a pattern in a dream I couldn't recall. I started timing it. The movement always began at 03:11 down to the second. It lasted 7 minutes, give or take 10 seconds. The path was never the same, but the sound always passed over my bunk last. I placed a notebook near the vent, hoping to catch any markings or residue. What I found instead was far worse. The cover of the notebook had 3 long scrapes across it. Diagonal, clean, deliberate. They hadn't pierced the pages beneath. Just the cover. As if the thing had been curious, but respectful of the written word. That same night, I dreamt of the corridor again. But this time, I was behind one of the doors, watching myself walk past in slow motion, and something unseen was crawling across the ceiling above me. I knew I couldn't ignore it. I brought a wrench and unscrewed the front plate of the ventilation grill. Inside, dust and rusted bolts lined the narrow shaft. And something else, just out of reach, gleamed faintly. I used a mirror to angle my phone's flashlight and got a glimpse. It was a scrap of cloth, navy blue, just like our uniforms, caught on an inner joint. Next to it, long parallel scratches on the inside surface of the duct. Not like tool marks, like claw marks. I reached in with a hanger to snag the fabric and managed to pull it out. It wasn't just cloth. It was the name patch from a uniform. The stitching was faded, but the name was there. Grayson. One of the men who'd transferred off 3 weeks before after suffering a psychotic episode. At least, that's what we were told. I asked around. No one remembered him leaving. No one even remembered him serving on this ship. I checked the duty logs. There was no Grayson listed in the crew manifest for the past 6 months. But I remembered him. He had the top bunk across from mine. He used to hum when he was nervous, and his boots always squeaked. And now, it was like he had been erased. But not by accident. By design. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat awake and watched the vent. At 03:11, the sound came. Only this time, it didn't move. It stayed above me. The scraping continued. Then it stopped, and something pressed against the grill from inside. Just enough to bow it outward. Just enough to let me see the outline of 5 fingers and a palm. Human. But too long. Too thin. It held there, unmoving, as if waiting for acknowledgement. I couldn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, very slowly, it traced a shape into the metal dust on the inside of the grill. A single word. Stay! The hand vanished. The metal snapped back. The sound crawled away. In the morning, the ship's PA system glitched for 3 full minutes, broadcasting a garbled loop of voices whispering unintelligibly, except for one word, repeated clearly every 15 seconds. Stay. 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 I tried to tell someone, but the comms officer told me I must have imagined it, that the PA had undergone routine testing overnight, that nothing unusual had been recorded. I asked for the audio log. He told me there was no log, that I should get some rest. I slept in the hallway that night. There's a rule on every ship, spoken or unspoken, that you never mess with another sailor's locker. It's a matter of respect, of privacy, and, on vessels like the Harrisburg, of self-preservation. We all knew that some things weren't ours to see, even if they were left open, even if they called to us. After the hand in the ventilation, I stopped trusting the ship's silence. Silence wasn't absence anymore. It was hiding. It was waiting. I started noticing the way certain compartments seemed colder than others without reason. How some hallways would flicker their lights only when you walked alone. How people had stopped meeting each other's eyes when crossing paths at night. But it was the locker next to mine that pulled me under again. It belonged to no one, and yet it was always locked. There was no name tag. The hinges were older than the rest, dull and mottled with rust, like they'd been transplanted from another era of the ship's life. I'd always assumed it was an old supply locker, maybe a spare assigned to an officer long gone. But one night, as I returned from a routine check on the communications panel, I heard it. A whisper. At first, I thought someone was speaking behind me. I turned. Empty corridor. Then again, low, wet syllables, like breath sliding across a pipe, coming from just over my shoulder. I turned and found myself staring directly at the locker door. It whispered again, but not words I understood. It wasn't English. It wasn't even human language. It was rhythm without syntax, an alien lullaby spoken by something that had never needed a voice until now. I stood frozen, feeling the sound more in my spine than in my ears, until it stopped. I leaned in, like a fool. I pressed my ear to the cold metal. I heard breathing, slow, controlled, matching my own. Then it changed, grew faster, deeper. Not an echo, a separate presence. Listening, measuring. I jumped back. The air around me felt suddenly electric, like the moment before lightning touches ground. I waited for something to erupt from it, to lunge, to claim. But nothing did. The whispering stopped, and I left. The next day, I checked the locker manifest. That number wasn't assigned to anyone. It hadn't been for years. I brought it up to Petty Officer Ramirez, who had been on board longer than most, and he looked at me like I'd asked where the ship's mouth was. "Leave it," he said. "If it talks to you, you don't talk back." He walked away before I could ask anything else. I tried ignoring it. For 3 nights, I left my rack early, slept in the galley, told people I had a stomach bug. But on the 4th night, I returned, and the locker was open. Just a crack. Like a mouth parting in anticipation. I should have run. I didn't. I pulled the door gently. It opened with a moan, dry and slow, like it hadn't been touched in decades. Inside was a single uniform hanging limp, a navy dress set from the 70s, the fabric perfectly preserved, buttons polished to a shine. The name tag had been covered in black tape. No boots, no socks. Just the uniform, and a cap sitting crookedly on the top shelf, with salt stains in the band as if it had been worn for years underwater. I reached out to touch it. The moment my fingers brushed the sleeve, a shock ran up my arm, like the static of 1,000 whispered names forced into flesh. I pulled back. The locker door slammed shut on its own. I stepped away, heart pounding, palms wet, breath short. Then I saw something that hadn't been there before. A slip of paper, crumpled at the base of my own locker. I picked it up. 3 words, scratched in ink that had bled through the fibers. I was here. I showed it to Ramirez. He refused to take it, but I saw his eyes betray recognition. "You need to stop opening things," he said. "The ship remembers." That was all he'd say. Later that week, I overheard an old crew member, someone transferring off at the next port, muttering to himself in the mess. I leaned close, pretending to grab coffee, and caught a single line repeated under his breath. "Don't claim a dead man's space." I didn't ask. I didn't want him to stop. But he saw me listening and went quiet. That night, I found a new tag on the locker next to mine. The tape had peeled back slightly, enough to read the first letter beneath. A G. I stayed awake until dawn. I heard the whisper again, softer this time, like it was hoarse from trying. It said my name. It was just supposed to be a routine inventory, a digital maintenance sweep of archived files stored deep in the ship's comms repository. Boring work, tedious even, but I had volunteered. After the incident with the whispering locker, I had begun to suspect that information on the Harrisburg was being buried, not lost. The systems officer on duty handed me access to a terminal in the communications vault, a chilled metal room tucked behind bulkhead 12F, mostly used for training recordings, encrypted transmissions, and legacy black box backups. Most of the files were unusable, corrupted, or lost in formatting transitions over decades of patchwork software updates. But one folder resisted deletion, fought it almost, as I attempted to wipe a block of outdated naval comms. It blinked red. "Directory locked. Requires captain-level override." I blinked. The system had no record of such a folder existing just seconds before. Its title was simple: Z-Deck Observation, Midnight Watch Logs. I shouldn't have opened it. Inside were 57 video files. Most were labeled with dates from the 1980s and early 1990s. No mission tags, no metadata. Just timestamps between 2350 and 0330, one for each. I clicked the first one, and the feed stuttered into life. Grainy black and white footage from a fixed security camera pointed at a steel hallway, a few inches lower than standard design. The angle was slightly off, like the camera had been mounted in haste. In the footage, 3 crewmen stood before a rusted bulkhead, clearly sealed, their expressions unreadable under the dim emergency light. One of them turned, knocked once, then again, then paused. The door opened on its own. They entered. The feed ran for 6 more minutes. No audio. The corridor remained empty. Then, something leaned into the frame. Something not wearing a uniform. A pale, long-fingered hand gripped the wall. A moment later, the feed cut out. I watched another tape. This one showed a sailor walking alone toward the camera from a distance. The hallway was warped slightly, or the lens was. His walk was sluggish, like he moved through heavier air. His face looked blurred, but it wasn't motion. It was like the image couldn't resolve him fully. The date said 1994. At the 4-minute mark, he stopped, turned to face the lens. His eyes, wide open, locked directly with mine. And for just a breath, I swore I saw my own face. Not younger, not aged. My face exactly as it was now. He smiled. The feed ended. I leaned back from the terminal, skin crawling, breath shallow. The room was cold, but I was sweating. My reflection in the black screen flickered slightly behind the overlay of text. I turned off the monitor. The hum of the hard drives no longer felt mechanical. It felt hungry, breathing. The next day, I asked around quietly about the comms archive. No one knew what I was talking about. Even the systems officer who had let me in claimed I'd never asked. His tone was sharp, rehearsed, like he'd been told how to respond. I walked past the archive door again that evening. Only now, it was sealed. A new biometric lock had been welded into place. Red light, no access, no explanation. That night, I found a VHS tape under my pillow. No label, no markings, Just black plastic, rewound. There hadn't been a VCR on board for decades, but down in the supply maintenance crawl near the aft loading section, I remembered seeing a unit, likely used for training modules during the Gulf War. I went there, alone, past curfew. The lighting was weak and yellow, the kind that flickered not from malfunction but fatigue. I pushed the tape in. The screen turned on with a burst of static. Then a hallway. Not one I recognized. The walls were older, bolted in a pattern I'd never seen in ship schematics. A single man stood at the far end, arms folded. No motion for over 2 minutes. Then, as if on cue, the camera panned, though there was no one to move it. Slowly. To the left. To the right. Finally, it turned back. The man was gone. In his place stood me. But this time I was bleeding. Deep lines carved down my arms, dried black over time. My mouth opened and closed, as if forming words, but no sound came through. I reached forward, and the feed snapped to black. For a full 30 seconds, nothing but darkness. Then one word appeared, burned into the screen in white block letters. Down. I ejected the tape, hands shaking. When I looked up, the supply crawl space was pitch black. No lights. I fumbled to my feet, pulled out my flashlight. When the beam came on, I nearly dropped it. Every wall, every pipe, every box in that room had one word written in grease pencil. Down. Some were scrawled in frantic loops, others etched carefully like warnings. The air was heavy. Breathing became harder. I ran. I didn't sleep that night. When I returned to my bunk, the locker beside mine, the one with the whispering uniform, was open again. And there, inside, sat the same tape I had just returned to the crawl space. Despite it never having left my hands, I didn't touch it. I closed the locker gently and crawled into bed fully dressed, staring at the ceiling. By morning, the tape was gone. Ramirez saw the look on my face and pulled me aside. He said only this: "The ship doesn't forget what you've seen. It waits, watches, and once it shows you one face, it will keep showing more." I asked him what that meant. He didn't answer. Later, I found a new tape. This time on my bunk. My name was written on it. It was dated 3 days in the future. Compartment 43 didn't exist on any ship diagram I had ever seen, and yet it was printed in pristine stenciled paint above a hatch behind the deactivated water filtration tanks, 2 decks beneath the galley. It was the kind of place you'd only find by accident, or if something wanted you to. I hadn't been searching for it. I had been trying to get away, from the whispering locker, from the tapes, from the way my own name was beginning to show up in places I knew I had never written it. But the ship is not built like a city with clear streets and logic. It is a coiled thing, a maze that rearranges itself when no one is watching. And when I turned the wrong way down a storage corridor sealed since the 90s, I found it. Compartment 43. The hatch opened at my touch like it had been waiting. No sound. No resistance. The air inside was dead and dry. I stepped through slowly, half expecting alarms, but the world held its breath. The room was small, perhaps 8 feet by 10. There were no crates, no bunks, no gear. Only a single object mounted to the far wall. An antique mirror, framed in black metal, fogged in the corners as though it had been breathing. Its surface was fractured, but not shattered. Fine spiderwebs of cracks spread from the center, and the glass shimmered strangely, like oil on water. The moment I looked into it, I stopped moving. I saw the corridor behind me, but not the one I had just come through. This was different. The angles were off. The floor dipped slightly, like the ship was sagging. The lights flickered in sync with something else, a rhythm I couldn't place. And people walked through it. Not people I recognized, not my crewmates, but sailors in outdated uniforms, black and white like old footage. They moved backward, every one of them. Faces vacant, jaws open just enough to seem like they were screaming without sound. One passed right behind me in the reflection, and I turned instantly. No one was there. But when I looked back into the mirror, the same figure now stood still, his back to me. Then slowly, agonizingly slow, he turned his head. His face was blurred, smeared like a painting erased with a wet thumb. I reached for the mirror. My hand passed through it. Not gently, not like air. It sank, like being pulled into warm syrup, viscous and reluctant. I yanked it back, and the sensation clung to me like static, like memory. Something deep in the pit of the ship echoed. A low thud, not mechanical, but organic. It resonated through the soles of my boots. I stared into the mirror again. The corridor was gone. Now it showed only darkness. And in the very back, something breathed. I stepped back, not daring to blink. But the mirror began to pulse. Faint, dim bursts of light from within it, almost like a heartbeat. It was calling to me. There's no other way to explain it. It wasn't language, but it was communication. The message was simple. You saw it. Now it sees you. I left the compartment. I tried to retrace my path, but the ship twisted. I swear to God, it twisted around me. Corridors that had been sealed were now open. Ones I had just walked down no longer existed. At some point, I realized I had passed the same junction 3 times, but the details were different each time. A valve that hadn't been rusted was now corroded. A warning stencil that had read, "Pressure," now read, "Pressing." I passed a bulkhead and saw myself reflected in a metal panel, and for a fraction of a second, the version of me in the reflection didn't move. When I finally returned to the crew decks, 4 hours had passed. My watch said it was just after midnight, but the clocks in the control room said it was Oro 3:15. I had no memory of the missing time. No one had seen me leave. No one had seen me return. And yet, when I checked the maintenance log, a new entry had been added in my name. Routine check, compartment 43, cleared. I hadn't written it. That night I had a dream. Or maybe it was more than that. I was standing in the same compartment, but this time the mirror had no cracks. Its surface was perfectly smooth, and inside I saw myself kneeling before it, whispering a name over and over. I couldn't hear the name, but I knew what it meant. It was the name the ship had chosen for me, not the one I was given at birth, the one it had written on the pipes, the one from the tape, the one it wanted me to remember. I woke up with the taste of salt in my mouth. My bunk was soaked with condensation, though the room wasn't cold. And drawn on the inside of my locker door, written in my own handwriting, was the outline of a rectangle and 3 words beneath it. Bring it back. I checked the route to compartment 43 again the next morning, determined to see if I'd imagined it, if perhaps the stress of the past few days had finally broken me. But the access corridor was gone, welded shut, sealed with fresh metal. No stenciled sign, no hatch, just a blank wall. Later that week, I passed a senior officer in the mess hall. He looked at me too long. I stopped and saluted. He didn't salute back, just leaned in and whispered, "We don't talk about 43. Not unless you want the mirror to show you what else you are." I didn't eat that night. I didn't sleep either. Every time I closed my eyes, the mirror blinked back. It started as a faint hum, softer than the thrum of the turbines, lower than the vibration that traveled up the soles of our boots every second of every day aboard the Harrisburg. At first, I thought it was just a resonance, an anomaly from the aging hull, a product of old metal pressed against old ocean. But it had rhythm, and not the mechanical rhythm we were used to, not the clean rotation of screws or the pulse of sonar sweeps. This was biological, wet, deliberate, a bass throb that sat beneath the ship's noises like a secret heartbeat. I only noticed it in the quiet moments, those rare times between shifts, or during night watches when the air itself felt thinner. It would rise slowly, just below hearing, then linger behind the ears like the echo of a voice you never quite caught, and then it would vanish, like it was never there. I kept it to myself at first. Who wouldn't? After everything I had seen, the mirror, the tapes, the locker that whispered my name, I had no desire to add phantom noise to my growing file of paranoia. But over time, it became harder to ignore. The sound started following me. It would surface when I was alone. In the shower, I'd hear it beneath the water. In the mess, under the chatter of utensils and conversation. Sometimes I'd stop eating, fork mid-air, and realize I was chewing in sync with it, like my own body was adjusting to a beat it didn't understand. One night, I went down to engineering under the pretense of checking the auxiliary generators. I waited until the crew thinned out, until only one petty officer remained nodding off behind a console. Then I climbed behind the coolant manifold, sat on the steel floor, and just listened. It was clear down there. Thump, thump, pause, thump, 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 like a sequence, not random. I pulled out the pocket recorder I had stolen from comms during my 3rd week and held it near the grating. I recorded 5 full minutes, then returned to my berth and transferred the file to my encrypted drive. I used a declassified spectrograph tool we sometimes used for sonar anomalies. Rudimentary, but enough to visualize patterns. What appeared on the screen didn't look like vibration. It looked like a waveform, but organic. Peaks and troughs spaced like speech. I isolated a section and played it on loop. After 15 iterations, I could swear it was saying something. The cadence mimicked breath and syllables, but it wasn't English. It wasn't any language I knew. Still, my brain kept trying to shape it into words. That's how I knew it was intentional. Not interference. Not the ship creaking under pressure. Something beneath us was trying to communicate. I transferred the file to a new drive and labeled it benignly. Z-Deck Bulkhead Stress Test. Then I brought it to Sergeant Yancey, one of the few comms techs who still talked to me. He was older than most, in his early 40s, and had been on the Harrisburg nearly a decade. I didn't say much. Just told him I had picked up a weird frequency and wanted to know if he could filter it. He agreed, grumbling about rookies with too much curiosity. I left him the drive. When I returned the next day, he was gone. No one said why. His bunk was stripped, his locker empty. A note on the log said medical leave, but no medics had been dispatched. I checked the infirmary manifest. There was no record of Yancey checking in. I pulled a favor with Shu, one of the cooks who helped supply the infirmary with dry goods. She whispered that she'd seen a body bag being loaded into the freezer around 0400 that morning. No name, no record, just another subtraction. The next time I listened to the file, I noticed a new anomaly. On the 12th loop, in the background, barely audible beneath the primary rhythm, my name. Not loud, not clear, but undeniable. It whispered from behind the pulse like a stowaway in the signal. I isolated that section and played it back at half speed. Still there. Not just my name, my voice. Whispering it. Whispering itself. I deleted the file. I destroyed the drive. But I kept hearing it anyway. I stopped sleeping properly. I'd close my eyes, and the pulse would return, louder, insistent. I'd wake drenched in sweat, convinced the Harrisburg was no longer floating on the ocean, but suspended inside something vast and conscious, and breathing. One night, desperate, I confronted Chief Branson. He was the highest-ranking officer I had any access to, and though he rarely acknowledged me, I caught him alone in the forward galley just before dawn. I told him everything. The sound, the file, the voice. He looked at me for a long time, spoon halfway to his mouth, before setting it down gently. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to me without a word, and left the room. It was a medical discharge form, pre-signed, dated a month prior. My name already filled in. Reason: psychological degradation due to auditory hallucinations. It was already in the system. He had been waiting. I didn't file it. I didn't leave. I burned the form in the galley sink and flushed the ashes. That night, I returned to the engine room and sat near the manifold again. This time, I brought headphones and let the vibration speak to me for hours. It wasn't language, not in the human sense, but it was structured, meaningful. The Harrisburg wasn't malfunctioning. It was broadcasting. Every deck, every corridor, an extension of some deeper signal. We weren't crew. We were listeners. Eventually, someone would hear back. It happened on a Thursday. The kind of slow, shapeless day where the sky outside the portholes was nothing but flat steel gray, and the sea was an infinite mirror reflecting back nothing of value. The kind of day when the air inside the Harrisburg felt more recycled than usual, as if we were breathing something old and resentful that had nowhere else to go. The announcement came at 14:07 hours. Unidentified crew member recovered on Deck 3, portside passage. No further clarification. Just that. No emergency sirens, no all-call for med staff. Just a passing sentence over the intercom, clipped and unbothered, as though someone had misplaced a wrench and found it behind a pipe. But we all knew who it was. Petty Officer Mason Roth had been missing for 17 days. Disappeared during a systems check in the water reclamation bay. No distress call, no security footage of his exit, no body recovered. He just failed to show up for mess one evening and never reappeared. After the 4th day, whispers began. After the 8th, rumors. By the 12th, he had become another quiet part of the ship's mythos. Absorbed by the Z-Deck. One more name scratched off with a lie typed into an official report. I remember the night he vanished because it was the first time I heard the breathing noise echo through the toilet pipes. We weren't allowed to approach him when they brought him up. 2 men flanked him, neither in medical gear, neither standard crew. They wore old uniforms, insignias yellowed with salt and time, like they'd been pulled from storage lockers untouched since the 1980s. Roth walked between them, barefoot, his coveralls torn and soaked as if he'd climbed up through ballast water. His hair was wrong, matted in places, but too long for 17 days. His eyes darted rapidly in every direction except where people stood, like he was tracking something moving on a plane we couldn't see. They took him through the corridor and turned left toward the medical bay. I followed from a distance, unnoticed or simply ignored. I waited 5 minutes, then crept down the same hall and stood outside the bay's sealed door. No voices, no motion, just the faint beeping of diagnostic equipment and something else. Slow, deep scraping sounds, like furniture being dragged across metal. Then came the whisper. They know my name now. I froze. I hadn't imagined it. The voice was Roth's. But not the voice I remembered. It was slower, stretched like old tape, rasping through layers of dust that hadn't yet settled. I leaned closer. Something tapped from the other side of the door. Once, then twice. I stepped back instinctively. Then silence. He didn't appear on the ship manifest after that day. His ID badge was deactivated, his berth was reassigned, his meals were never delivered. When I asked Ensign Lee about him the next day, she blinked twice and simply said, "Mason who?" as if the name triggered nothing at all in her brain. I went to the systems terminal and checked the crew logs. His name had been scrubbed, not deactivated, not listed as missing, but removed entirely, as though he had never boarded the Harrisburg. I checked his communications records, his emails, his access logs, all gone. But his file had left something behind. A ghost echo in the system. A blinking red error message that simply said, "User exists without origin." I tried accessing it, but the system crashed and took the terminal offline for repairs. When I asked IT, they said the wiring had shorted from internal heat, on a console that hadn't been touched in 48 hours. That night I returned to the corridor outside Medbay. I didn't expect to find anything, just needed to confirm the nothingness. But the door wasn't sealed. It hung slightly ajar, like it had been forced open by something inside rather than someone entering. The hallway was silent. No motion, no guards, no cameras. I pushed the door wider and stepped in. The lights flickered once, then stabilized. The bed was empty. The restraints dangled off the edges like vines that had failed to hold back something ancient and unwilling. On the wall, scratched into the surface with what looked like fingernails, were dozens of names, most unreadable, but one repeated in rows. Roth, 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 and next to one of them, a single message. They remember me now. I turned to leave, but the mirror above the sink caught my eye. There was no reflection. Not mine, not the room's, just the hallway behind me. Empty. Still. Waiting. The next morning, during routine maintenance, one of the hull engineers reported something strange near the ship's forward intake valve. The team found a handprint scorched into the metal, a perfect outline, blackened and fused with the surface like a brand. The fingers were longer than a human's, almost twice as long. The engineers laughed it off, blamed it on chemical residue and old paint. But I saw the security footage. I shouldn't have, but I did. There was no residue, no paint. Just Roth, standing barefoot at the edge of the hull at 03:12 a.m., one hand pressed gently against the steel, whispering something into the dark ocean before vanishing from the frame. Not turning, not walking, just gone. I told myself it was a loop, a glitch, a splice from older footage. But later that day, my bunk began to vibrate again. Not like before. This time, it pulsed in rhythm. 5 beats. Pause. 5 beats. Pause. Like a door knocking from the other side of the ship. My dreams that night were filled with water. Not drowning. Just floating. Weightless. Watching the ship from the outside. Watching myself through the hull glass. Watching Roth watching me back. And then I knew. He had come back to warn us. But it wasn't just his voice anymore. It was mine, too. It began subtly, with something I initially dismissed as coincidence, or maybe even imagination induced by sleep deprivation. We were nearing the edge of our scheduled deployment zone, a stretch of unbroken ocean that looked the same on every satellite image. The days had become a smear of fluorescent light and clock rotations, and the tension in my chest had settled like an uninvited passenger. I'd taken to walking alone through the quieter maintenance sectors at night. pretending the solitude was voluntary, that it offered clarity instead of isolation. That's when I saw it. My name, written in faded red marker across the side of a rusting coolant pipe that snaked along the rear wall of compartment 7B. It was exact. First name, middle initial, last. D.M. Kessler. No smudges, no wear. Fresh, but not wet. As if it had been written moments before I arrived. There were no cameras in that section, just storage crates, old tools, and humming steel. I ran my fingers over the name. The surface was cold, but the letters were slightly raised, as if the pipe itself had exhaled the ink onto its own skin. I didn't tell anyone. Not because I feared ridicule, but because some part of me instinctively understood it was a message not meant to be spoken aloud. I returned the next night, half expecting the name to be gone. But it was still there, and it wasn't alone. 2 more names had appeared, written just beneath mine. One I recognized, Roth. The other was unreadable, scratched so violently into the pipe's paint that the metal beneath had warped. Over the following days, the sightings multiplied. On the underside of a panel in the fire suppression chamber, Kessler, 07/18/2025. My name again, now with a date. A date 3 days into the future. On the back of a disconnected control board in the comms bay, Roth, witnessed. In the crew galley, beneath the countertop where we prepared our coffee, someone had etched, "Speak low or the ship listens." Each inscription more precise, more personal. Each one written in a different hand. At first, I thought someone was messing with me. A twisted prank. But then I remembered that some of these locations were sealed. Off-limits due to outdated wiring or atmospheric imbalance. Places where no one was supposed to enter. Places I had only accessed because I'd seen them marked in the Phantom Z deck blueprint I still kept hidden on a personal flash drive. One night, I pulled that file up again and noticed something new. A section at the very bottom, previously blank, now displayed a tiny rotating icon, an animation of a pen writing. I clicked it. Nothing happened, but the cursor began to lag across the screen, skipping as if the system itself was resisting my input. Then the screen flashed black and the words appeared. Where they go, you follow. I yanked the USB from the port and threw it into the trash incinerator chute. The screen stayed black for 6 more seconds, then rebooted. The terminal behaved normally after that. But when I walked to the engine maintenance corridor the next morning, I saw the words again, painted across the bulkhead in thick, slanted red. Where they go, you follow. That day, I stopped eating. I didn't trust the food or the water. I began sleeping in short bursts, afraid that if I closed my eyes too long, I'd wake up in a place deeper inside the ship, some place that no longer obeyed the blueprints or laws of pressure and physics. On the 4th night of my hunger, I stumbled into the oxygen reserve chamber, desperate to breathe air that hadn't passed through the same haunted ventilation as everything else. I collapsed against the wall and pressed my forehead to the cool metal. When I opened my eyes, I saw the inside of the access hatch had something scratched into it. My name again, this time written backward, as if meant to be read from inside. I began to hear voices, not sibilant whispers like before, but clear, deliberate sentences spoken in a voice that almost sounded like mine. The inflection was wrong, clipped and lifeless, as though spoken by someone rehearsing humanity. The sentences were simple. You're already here. It's not your name anymore. They knew it before you were born. I tried reporting it once, muttering to Lieutenant Braddock that someone was tagging the ship with crew names. He blinked at me twice, then said, "No one's called you Kessler since the Gulf." I hadn't served in the Gulf. I wasn't even enlisted back then. One night, in the corridor connecting Deck 2 to the medical bay, I found a plaque affixed to the wall. It hadn't been there before. A small bronze nameplate polished to a mirror shine. It read D.M. Kessler, 1982-2006. My name, my birth year, and a death date I hadn't yet reached. When I touched the plaque, it was warm. I looked around. No one was there, but I swear I heard the faint sound of clapping. Slow, distant, as though echoing from the very bowels of the ship. Then, the final confirmation. The writing on the flag. During an emergency drill, I was assigned to inspect the ceremonial flag stored in the ship's memorial locker. It was a folded U.S. naval flag kept pristine since the 1980s, used for honoring lost crewmen. When I unfolded it, a piece of parchment slipped out, yellowed, thin. On it, in perfectly centered print, it said, "In memory of Petty Officer Daniel M. Kessler, lost at sea 2006. Body never recovered." My ID badge dropped from my hand. My pulse vanished for a moment, and then it returned, stronger than ever, like it belonged to someone else. Someone watching. I still have that parchment. I didn't report it. I folded the flag back and returned it to the locker. When I closed the hatch, I noticed something else on the door. The inside of the memorial locker bore a row of tally marks. Hundreds of them, but one was fresh. Still damp with ink. A single stroke that hadn't dried yet. I didn't touch it. I didn't breathe. That night, I dreamed I was underwater. Not drowning, just drifting. Slowly rising toward the hull of the USS Harrisburg. Inside, I could see my body standing in the hallway. But when I blinked, my reflection blinked a second too late. Like it was watching me for cues. Like it was practicing. And all around me, written across the walls of the ocean floor, were names. Thousands of names. And every single one of them was mine. It started with the echo of my own footsteps sounding one beat too late. That was all. I was heading down into the lower access tubes to investigate another noise. One of many I'd been told to ignore. The kind of noise that never gets logged but still haunts your sleep, crawling into your skull like an idea you can't scrape out. This time it was described as a soft dragging, like rope being pulled across metal, reported by two different technicians who never spoke to each other. That alone made it credible. Most of the ship had fallen into a collective silence. No one willing to admit they heard the things everyone heard, or saw what they shouldn't. So when two strangers whispered the same fear in the same hour, I took it as fact. I descended through the primary shaft between Deck 3 and what we now called Z level, a name no longer said jokingly. The hatch that led to the Z corridor had once required override codes and a crowbar. Now it hung open as if waiting. Inside, the temperature was colder than usual. My breath visibly coiled in the flashlight's beam, which flickered even though the batteries were fresh. The corridor ahead sloped ever so slightly downward, just enough to make your steps feel uneven. I moved forward, noting the riveted walls, the antique light fixtures with broken bulbs, and the faint whine of metal expanding somewhere far beneath me, or above. It was impossible to tell direction anymore. About 20 paces in, I turned to check the path behind me. It was gone, not just dark, gone. The hatchway I had entered through was no longer visible, even when I stepped backward, waving the flashlight in frantic arcs. Only more corridor, stretching in both directions, identical in shape and decay. That was when the echo split. My footfall landed once, and a second time just after it, like someone walking in sync half a step behind. I stopped. The echo did not. I broke into a controlled jog, not running, not panicking, just moving fast enough to feel in control. I counted the junctions. First right, dead end. Second right, another corridor. Third left, a stairwell that spiraled down into darkness. I ignored it, took the next right, and found myself staring back at the first intersection. The same scuff mark I had made with my boot on the wall when I slipped. I was back where I had started. I hadn't turned around. I marked the wall with a thick slash of black marker from my tool pouch and moved on again. Right. Straight. Left. Forward. Another loop. The mark was waiting. Slightly smeared. I cursed under my breath and tried another pattern, but it didn't matter. The corridor wasn't obeying logic. It bent, not just space, but intention. It knew I was trying to leave. That's when I stopped thinking like a sailor and started thinking like prey. I turned and walked the opposite direction. Back toward the coldest draft. Back toward the dragging sound. The walls narrowed, the ceiling lowered. I had to duck after a while, stepping over exposed piping that hadn't been part of the original schematics. On the left wall, a thin black line ran like a vein, pulsing faintly under the beam of my light. When I reached for it, the pulse slowed as if reacting. I drew my hand back. It resumed. Eventually I reached a door. Just a door. Not rusted or marked or ominous. It looked new. Sterile. It opened by itself. Inside was a room, plain and rectangular, lit by overhead fluorescents that buzzed like insects. At the center was a table, long and metallic, surrounded by 8 chairs. 7 were occupied. I didn't recognize any of them. Men and women in various uniforms, none of which matched any current naval designation. Their faces were pale, eyes unblinking, hands folded neatly on the table. They looked at me the way taxidermy eyes look, interested, but immobile. And then, with perfect synchronicity, they nodded once. The eighth chair scraped back slowly. Empty. Waiting. I didn't move. I didn't speak. The door closed behind me with a hiss. The room did not breathe. No one exhaled. I took a step back. One of them blinked. Another smiled. Too wide. The room stretched slightly, like a camera lens pulling perspective. I turned and reached for the door handle, but it was gone. The door was smooth metal now, without edges. I hit it with my shoulder. Nothing. When I turned around, the eighth chair was no longer empty. I saw myself. Seated. Calm. Wearing my face. Wearing my uniform. But not mimicking me. Inhabiting me. It smiled, not maliciously, but with a recognition that chilled the marrow. The others looked at it, nodded again, and turned their heads toward me in unison. The walls groaned, and the floor beneath me hummed like a tuning fork. I stumbled backward, and the lights blinked out. For a moment, only silence. Then, the faint scraping resumed. When the lights came back on, the table was empty. Chairs gone. Room barren. Just one note on the floor, folded neatly. My name on the outside. Inside, the seat is yours. Take it before it takes you. I don't know how I escaped that room. I don't remember walking out, or the path that led me back to my quarters. But I woke in my own bunk with my boots still on, mud on the soles, and the note folded beneath my pillow. My watch, which had been calibrated only hours earlier, now read 23:57, 3 minutes to midnight. And the ship was quiet. Too quiet. Not even the engines hummed. I got up and walked to the hallway outside. Nothing but darkness stretched in both directions. I blinked once. The lights flickered on. The corridor was empty. But the chair was there now, at the end of the hallway, alone, facing me, waiting. I started waking up to messages, not dreams, not voices, real messages, spoken through the ship's intercom system in the middle of the night, when only the engineers on rotation and a few security personnel should have had access. At first, I thought I was imagining it, maybe replaying something from earlier shifts, but the words weren't standard Navy lingo. They weren't requests or calls for maintenance or even emergency codes. They were sentences like, "He is ready. Go now. It sees. He listens." I'd sit upright in my rack, the faint crackle of the comm system still buzzing like a dying insect in the wall. Then silence. Utter, paralyzing silence. I'd check my watch. Always between 03 WAD and 03:15. Never a second earlier. Never a second later. I confronted the comms officer, a gaunt man named Riley, whose cheeks looked like they'd been carved out by insomnia. He barely looked at me as I asked if he'd heard anything unusual. He just shook his head once and said, "Don't log it. That's all that matters." I asked again, more firmly this time, demanding if those messages came from the bridge. His eyes finally met mine, sunken and glassy, and all he said was, "It sends its own orders." Then he requested leave. Not just leave. Discharge. Said he needed to be on dry land or he wouldn't make it to next month. They granted it faster than usual. He was flown off the Harrisburg within 6 hours, and I never saw him again. But the orders didn't stop. They escalated. Now they came through the wall speakers even when I was awake, in the mess hall, in the gym, even during briefings. One time, in the middle of a routine inspection drill, the PA erupted with a low, throbbing hum, followed by a message. "You know the way." Everyone froze. The officers ignored it. No one logged it. A few sailors chuckled nervously, but their eyes betrayed the unease. We all heard it. All of us. And we all pretended we didn't. One morning I found a printed note in my locker. Plain font. No header. No stamp. Just 3 words. Return. Below. Now. I took it to the captain. He told me not to waste his time. When I showed him the paper, he glanced once and said, "You should burn that." He didn't ask where I found it. He didn't ask who gave it to me, just that, burn it. And then he left, his face pale, his steps uneven. Later that day, while checking the cooling systems on Deck 2, the radio on my tool belt crackled to life with a command in perfect monotone. "Z-Deck, proceed immediately. Entry authorized." I froze. The request hadn't come from the bridge channel. It didn't come from engineering or watch control either. The source read, "Swiss route." A system admin code that, as far as I knew, didn't even exist on our registry. And when I checked with IT, they told me the log didn't show any outbound message sent to my receiver. It hadn't come from the ship. It had come from the ship itself. That night, I stayed awake. I watched the intercom. I watched the walls. I watched the door to my quarters as the shadows shifted slightly around the edges, even though the hallway was empty. At exactly 03 quinze, the speakers buzzed again and said, "You are being expected." Nothing more. I didn't respond. I didn't move. But something in the wiring did. I heard it shift, just outside the vent near my head. A low, crawling static that almost resembled breath. The next morning, the crew was quieter than usual. Half the mess seats were empty. The food was cold. And then I noticed the strange part. Everyone was holding their spoons in their left hands. Every single person. Not one of them had ever been left-handed before. I was sure of it. I asked Jenkins, the welder who always bragged about his perfect right-handed welds. He stared at me, puzzled, looked down at his spoon like he'd never held one before, then slowly switched hands. He didn't answer. None of them did. I checked the logs for system maintenance during the night. Found a data dump in the encrypted directory, something labeled Echo Root V4. When I opened the file, it wasn't code. It was a waveform, an audio signature maybe. I played it on a secure terminal in the communications bay. The sound was like water under pressure, mixed with rhythmic clicks, and a voice buried under both saying something in a loop. Come back, come back, come back, come back. Over and over. Then a pause. Then, take your place. My nose started bleeding. When I wiped it, the paper came back black. Not red. Thick like ink. I shut down the terminal and walked out, dizzy. The hallway lights above me flickered in succession as I passed, like they were watching. When I turned the corner toward the sleeping quarters, the emergency lights activated, briefly. Red glow. Then they flashed a word. Down. Only once. No alarms, no protocol. I passed a mirror on the bulkhead near the armory. My face was pale, yes, tired. But then, as I stared longer, the reflection smiled. I didn't. My face, my reflection, smiled with both corners raised unnaturally, and the eyes. They blinked out of sync with mine, just for a second. I smashed the mirror. Shards scattered across the steel floor, and I saw movement in each one. Each shard showing the corridor behind me, but with different figures walking past. All in Navy uniforms. All without faces. The ship was no longer just metal and rust and steel and command. It had breath. It had intention. It had language. And now, it was issuing commands independent of its crew. I returned to my bunk and found the pillow cold. Damp. Underneath, another note. This one handwritten. The script was mine. Perfectly mine. But I had never written it. You were given a place, fulfill it, or it will. That was when the system rebooted itself. The entire Harrisburg went dark for 4 seconds. Backup lights kicked in. Control panels flashed. The bridge called general quarters. No one moved. We all knew it wasn't a glitch. We knew it was a reset. Of us. Of everything. I heard it in the silence. A ship doesn't breathe. But this one inhaled. And it was waiting for me to exhale. There are places on a ship no one wants to be alone in. Not because they're haunted by rumor or history, but because they're soaked in a kind of silence that doesn't feel like silence at all. It's thick, electric, weighted like the pause before something breathes on your neck. For me, that place became the auxiliary washroom in the lowest corridor accessible before the Z-deck. It wasn't used often. Only overflow, or if maintenance shut down the main lavatories. The tiles were cracked in spiderweb patterns. The lights flickered regardless of power stability, and the air always smelled of rusted copper and warm mold. But it wasn't the filth or disrepair that bothered me. It was the drain. I'd been down there on cleaning detail. No one assigned it to me. I just needed to be away from the upper decks for a while, away from the looks, the whispered orders from the intercom, the cold spot under my bunk that never warmed, not even with 3 blankets. The door to the washroom creaked open like a jaw reluctant to speak. The floor inside was damp but not flooded. The ventilation hummed low, too low, almost subsonic. I began scrubbing the far sink, deliberately avoiding the one closest to the floor drain. Something about the drain always made me uneasy. Not fear. Not yet. Just that primal reluctance your body develops long before your mind knows why. But today, There was something different. As I scrubbed, I heard the faintest sound, like skin sliding against steel. Not metallic, not sharp, smooth, reptilian. It came from behind me, slow and deliberate, as though something inched its way into the room. I turned, half expecting Jenkins or Darius playing a prank. No one. Just the drain, open like a mouth. The grate was missing. Had it ever been there? I knelt down, slowly, the stiff brush still in hand like a weapon that wouldn't do a damn thing. I stared into it, and something stared back. Not a metaphor, not a hallucination. There was an eye inside the drain. An eye too large to belong to anything that should have fit within those pipes. It was dark gray, veined, the pupil an oval slit like a serpent's, and it was watching me with stillness so intense that it felt ancient. It didn't blink. It didn't retreat. It just observed. I fell back, my boots slipping against the wet tile, breath leaving me all at once. I crawled out of the room backward, never breaking eye contact, even as my heart thundered and my limbs screamed. Just before I turned the corner out of that hallway, I swear, I saw the eye roll slightly upward, as though it was smiling. I didn't report it. Who the hell would I tell? The captain who told me to burn mysterious notes? The comms officer who begged for discharge and vanished? The rest of the crew who now moved in synchronized patterns like dancers rehearsing a funeral march? No, I kept it to myself. But I watched. I began noting patterns. When the temperature dipped near that washroom, when the lights in the hallway outside buzzed in Morse-like rhythm, and I waited. 2 nights later, I returned, this time with Ramirez. I told him the plumbing might be backing up and that we should inspect it. He grumbled the whole way down, flashlight in hand, annoyed, skeptical, yawning like this was just another pointless errand. When we got there, the air had changed. He noticed it too. "Smells like dead wires," he muttered. I said nothing and gestured to the drain. "Tell me that looks normal," I said. The grate was back in place. Ramirez looked at me like I'd lost it. "What are you talking about, man? That's been sealed for years. They welded it after the flooding incident in '09. Ain't nobody opening that without a cutter." He stepped over to prove his point, stomped hard on the grate. It didn't even rattle. I bent down and looked again. Solid, impossibly solid. And yet I knew. There had been no cover when I first saw it. I saw the eye. It had been there. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my bunk, eyes fixed on the vent above me. At precisely 02:58, the floor beneath my bed pulsed. Not vibrated. Not trembled. Pulsed, like something massive was drawing breath below deck. My ears rang with pressure. Then, from the far corner of the room, a sound. A single drip. I got up, walked toward it, stepping cautiously. Another drip. Then another. But not down. Up. The water was dripping upward, from the floor toward the ceiling, defying every law of gravity. And when I followed the trail, it led back to the bathroom. I should have stayed in my room. I opened the lavatory door. No light flickered. No sound hummed. Just a dense, wet silence. The drain was uncovered again. The tile around it had blackened, as if scorched or rotted from the inside out. I knelt again, this time with a wrench in hand, and peered into the opening. It looked deeper than before, wider, almost like a tunnel, and from its depths, not an eye, but a voice. "You looked back," it said. Not in English, not with words. The meaning arrived directly in my mind, like memory mixed with dream. The voice wasn't inside my ears. It was behind them, inside my head. "You looked back." And then again, softer. "We are not done." I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the main deck, where the cold night wind hit my face like a slap. I vomited over the railing. No one approached, no one asked. The Harrisburg creaked below my feet, and I swear I could feel it smiling. The next morning, my shower was lukewarm. Nothing unusual, except when I turned off the water, I noticed something etched into the fogged mirror. Not written by finger, not smudged or drawn. Etched into the glass. One word. Soon. I left my quarters, unable to bear the feeling of being watched through the pipes, through the walls, through the drainage system of a ship that was never supposed to breathe. As I passed the storage bay on my way to the mess, I heard a gurgle, deep and drawn out. A pipe? A vent? Maybe. But then I saw a puddle on the ground, and from it, A single bubble rose. Inside, for a split second, an image flickered. An eye. Gray. Oval. Unblinking. The ship had found new ways to watch me, and I was starting to believe that maybe I hadn't looked into the drain. Maybe I had been looked out of it. Sleep no longer came. Not naturally, not safely. Each attempt was met with the distant groaning of pipes that bent like ribs in agony, or the gentle tap-tap-tap of something just beneath the mattress, as if the steel hull had grown hands. The ship no longer sailed on water. It drifted on something older, something below, like a coffin loosed in an endless black ocean. I stopped trusting the clocks. They blinked and changed at random. The numbers never stayed still long enough for me to know if it was truly night. But I felt it. The air thickened, grew colder, and the fluorescent lights flickered not out of malfunction, but rhythm, like a breathing thing. And it always began around midnight. That final night began with a voice. Not a whisper, not a hallucination. A voice. Familiar and foreign, layered and deep. It called my name. Not from a speaker, not from the hallway, but from beneath the floor. I lay frozen, eyes wide in the dark, listening as it rose again from the vent beneath my bed. My name. Clear. Slow. Patient. It wasn't requesting. It was summoning. There was no urgency in the sound. Only certainty. It knew I would come. I told myself I wouldn't. I sat up, drenched in cold sweat, heart skipping every other beat. I pressed my palms against my ears and hummed. I recited serial numbers, coordinates, the names of every ship in the fleet. None of it drowned it out. My name. Again. 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 The walls shuddered softly, like lungs expanding. I opened my locker and found a note inside, one I hadn't written. No handwriting. Just indented letters, pressed into the metal itself. Below. The letters were warm. By the time I reached the hatch to the Z-deck, I don't remember walking. My legs moved on their own, my mind trailing behind like a balloon on a frayed string. The corridor was darker than usual. The overhead lights had stopped flickering altogether. They simply went out one by one as I passed beneath them. The metal groaned underfoot, as if it disapproved of my presence but would allow it just this once. I reached the last door, the one I knew should lead only to maintenance, but it opened before I touched it. Inside, the air was thick, almost gelatinous, and tasted like old salt and static. The staircase beyond it was not the same one I had descended before. It spiraled, impossibly so, curving at angles that didn't obey the architecture of the ship. There were no warning signs, no emergency lights. Just steps and a long, slow hum, like a lullaby sung through a steel throat. I began to descend. Each step felt longer than the last. My legs should have tired. My breath should have shortened. But time had detached itself, unhooked like a lifeboat. At one point I looked back, just once, and saw only darkness. The entry hatch had vanished. Behind me, the stairs continued upward endlessly, yet offered no exit. Ahead, only down. Eventually, I reached the corridor. It wasn't the same as before. Gone were the locked doors and peeling paint. Now the walls were covered in something wet and pulsating, like veins had grown through the metal. The floor was warm, soft even, like walking on flesh that tolerated your weight. The lights came from no visible source, but everything glowed faintly red, as if illuminated by the interior of a dying star. I passed a mirror, shattered into symmetrical cracks, but my reflection wasn't mine. The man staring back wore my uniform, but his eyes were hollow, the whites replaced with the same deep gray I'd seen in the drain. His lips moved a second behind mine, and when I stopped, he kept speaking. I moved on. Then came the sounds. Not echoes, not ship groans. Breathing. From the walls, from beneath the floor, from above the ceiling, rhythmic, slow, massive. I was inside something alive, or it was inside me. I tried to remember why I had come, who I was, but the memories floated just beyond reach, like objects sinking below dark water. All that remained was the voice that had called me, growing louder as I moved forward, clearer, warmer. It welcomed me now. Eventually, the corridor ended in a chamber I hadn't seen before. Circular, cathedral-like, with a domed ceiling etched in symbols that shimmered like wet ink. At the center was a table, not steel, not wood. Bone, fused and polished, shaped into a surface that pulsed with faint light. Around it sat figures in navy uniforms, motionless, faceless, their skin darkened with rot, but eyes glowing faintly. One turned its head toward me, and I knew it. Ramirez. Then another. Jenkins. And another. Faces I had seen only in old logs, on photographs that didn't match any living crew. They all stared, silent, waiting. The voice returned, now not from one place but from everywhere. You opened the path. You looked back. You listened. You are known. The figures stood, slowly, in unison. Not aggressive, not angry, reverent, as if I had become something worthy of attention. I tried to step back, but the room spun, bending, the walls now curving inward like a throat-swallowing light. The figures circled me. I closed my eyes and heard only breath. When I awoke, I was back in my bunk. My clothes were soaked. My boots were missing. My dog tags were fused together into a single flat disc. I had bite marks on my left palm, not deep, but human. The vent beneath my bed no longer made noise. The drain in the lavatory was sealed. The ship hummed again as it always had. Everything was back to normal. Except, no one recognized me. The quartermaster blinked when I approached. "Name?" he asked. I told him. He searched. "No record," he said. I showed my ID. It had been replaced. A different name, a different serial, same face, same photo. The comms officer didn't flinch when I walked in. "New rotation?" she asked. The captain didn't acknowledge me. My bunk had no label, and yet the ship let me stay. I now walk the halls unseen, unquestioned. The others don't ask. They don't stare. At night, I hear voices calling other names through the vent. At 03:15 every morning, the mirror fogs and reveals new words, new warnings, always in my handwriting. And once a week, at exactly midnight, the grate near the mess rattles, just once, and something breathes beneath it. I shouldn't have gone down there, but the truth is, I never came back.